The Mosquito was a thoroughbred, the Beaufighter a barroom hooligan, and it still killed more enemy aircraft than the Mosquito ever did. That's the sentence that stops people cold. 965 aerial victories for the Bristol Beaufighter, 835 for the de Havilland Mosquito. Third deadliest fighter in the entire Royal Air Force. And yet, when someone mentions British twin-engine aircraft from the Second World War, they reach for the elegant wooden wonder, not the brutish metal brawler that actually posted the higher score. Here's the thing about thoroughbreds. They win races. They look magnificent doing it. Everyone applauds. But barroom hooligans? They break furniture. They hurt people on both sides. They walk out bleeding, missing teeth, shirt torn, and they walk out. The Beaufighter wasn't designed to be beautiful. It was designed to kill at night, and it did so with mechanical ruthlessness that its prettier cousin never quite matched. We need to talk about how this aircraft came to exist. Because understanding the Beaufighter means understanding that it was born from desperation, not inspiration. By 1938, the Air Ministry had a problem. Britain desperately needed a heavy fighter capable of carrying the new airborne interception radar sets, bulky equipment that simply wouldn't fit in a Spitfire or Hurricane. The Bristol Aeroplane Company did something that would have horrified any designer obsessed with aesthetics. They took existing parts from the Beaufort torpedo bomber, wings, tail unit, landing gear, and mated them to an entirely new fuselage. Frankenstein engineering, parts bin special. Think about what that actually meant on the factory floor at Filton. The Beaufort's wing was designed to carry torpedoes, not to provide the roll rate a fighter pilot needs. The tail unit was built for a bomber's flight envelope, not the violent manoeuvring of air combat. The landing gear was stressed for Beaufort weights and Beaufort sink rates. Bristol's engineers had to take these components, each designed for a completely different mission profile, and make them work together in an aircraft that would fly faster, hit harder, and handle more aggressively than anything the Beaufort ever attempted. The mathematics were brutal. A torpedo bomber cruises at 180 miles per hour and banks gently into its attack run. A night fighter dives at 350 miles per hour and pulls hard into a turning interception. The structural loads differ by factors of 3 or 4. Bristol's stress engineers had to identify every weak point in the borrowed components and reinforce them, sometimes by adding material that increased weight, sometimes by redesigning attachment points entirely, sometimes by accepting that certain maneuvers would simply be forbidden because the airframe couldn't handle them. The tail unit proved particularly troublesome. The Beaufort's horizontal stabilizer lacked sufficient authority for the higher speeds and tighter maneuvering the fighter role demanded. Bristol increased the dihedral, the upward angle of the tailplane, and enlarged the elevator surfaces. Even so, the aircraft retained a characteristic that would define its entire operational career. Notably unstable and hard to control on the y-axis. The Beaufighter wanted to wander. It wanted to hunt left and right in yaw, requiring constant rudder corrections that fatigued pilots on long patrols. In darkness, hunting bombers while simultaneously fighting your own aircraft's tendency to deviate from its heading, every flight became an exercise in divided attention. The result looked, in the words of many who encountered it, like 2 large engines followed by a small aircraft. Cyril Unwins, Bristol's chief test pilot, took the prototype into the air for the first time on July 17, 1939. Less than 2 months before war engulfed Europe. The swing on takeoff became notorious almost immediately. Both Bristol Hercules engines pumping out combined horsepower that wanted to rotate the nose in directions pilots didn't intend. Stamp on the wrong rudder pedal, relax your attention for half a second, and you're off the runway before you understand what happened. Sometimes wrapped in flames, sometimes walking away, often neither. The Hercules engines deserve particular attention, and not just because most accounts get them wrong. Picture a conventional automobile engine. Pistons moving up and down inside cylinders, with valves at the top that open and close to admit fuel mixture and expel exhaust. Those valves are operated by camshafts, pushrods, rocker arms, a complex mechanical chain that limits how fast the engine can spin and how much power it can produce. The Bristol Hercules used none of that. Instead of poppet valves opening and closing from above, the Hercules employed sleeve valves, cylindrical sleeves that surrounded each piston and rotated slightly with each cycle, ports in the sleeve aligning with ports in the cylinder wall to control the flow of gases. The advantages were significant. No valve stems to break, no valve springs to fatigue, smoother combustion chambers that resisted detonation, and the ability to run higher boost pressures without the pre-ignition that plagued conventional engines. The disadvantages were equally significant. Manufacturing tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, exotic metallurgy to handle the sliding contact between sleeve and cylinder, and maintenance procedures that demanded specialized knowledge. 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, each cylinder displacing over 2.5 litres. The whole assembly capable of producing over 1,600 horsepower through constant speed propellers. And here's the detail that separates people who actually know aircraft from people who pretend to. As air-cooled radials, these engines had no radiators. None. Zero. When a bullet punched through the engine cowling, there was no coolant to spray, no temperature gauge climbing toward red, no catastrophic seizure 10 miles from home. Liquid-cooled engines, the Merlins in Spitfires, the Griffons in later marks, could be killed by a single round through the coolant jacket. The Hercules could absorb punishment that would have destroyed an inline engine. The absence of a liquid cooling system meant one less way for the aircraft to die, and one less way for its crew to die with it. The armament was where the Beaufighter earned its reputation for violence. 4 20mm Hispano cannons clustered in the nose, each capable of firing 600 rounds per minute. 6 additional 7.7mm Browning machine guns mounted in the wings. When a Beaufighter pilot pressed the firing button, he unleashed a concentrated storm of explosive shells and tracer that could shred a heavy bomber in a 2-second burst. The problem was feeding those cannons reliably. The Hispano was a temperamental weapon. Feed mechanism jams were common, particularly in the cold, thin air of high-altitude interceptions. Armourers developed elaborate pre-flight rituals, warming the ammunition, carefully inspecting every round, adjusting the feed pools with obsessive precision. A single jam at the wrong moment could turn a successful interception into a missed kill, or worse. The enemy bomber's rear gunner wasn't going to wait politely while you cleared a stoppage. Now we have to talk about the nickname. Whispering Death. It sounds perfect, doesn't it? Evocative, haunting. The kind of detail that makes documentary narrators lean into their microphones with theatrical gravity. Except nobody can prove where it came from. Historical analysis of available documents reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how aviation mythology gets constructed. Sometimes the most memorable details are the ones with the least foundation. One book states plainly that Whispering Death was the name given by the Germans to the Beaufighter. Another source claims its quiet engine earned it the nickname in the Far East. Stop and consider this contradiction. The Germans, operating in the European theatre against Beaufighters in night fighting and coastal command roles, encountered a very different aircraft in very different conditions than Japanese forces facing Australian Beaufighters in New Guinea. The nickname cannot have originated in both places simultaneously. Yet both attributions appear in print without question, repeated by authors who apparently never asked the obvious question: which one is true? The quiet engine explanation deserves particular scorn. The Bristol Hercules was many things: powerful, reliable, relatively smooth for a radial, but quiet was not among them. 14 cylinders firing in rapid succession, each displacing over 2.5 litres, connected to constant speed propellers capable of absorbing over 1,600 horsepower. Stand next to a running Hercules sometime, if you can find one. You will not describe the experience as a whisper. You will describe it as a physical assault on your eardrums. The Beaufighter's approach would have been heralded by an unmistakable rumble, seconds of warning that often weren't enough, given the aircraft's devastating armament and the shock tactics employed by its crews. Examination of interrogation transcripts and captured diaries has failed to produce a single verified Japanese soldier writing the words "whispering death" in any document available for historical examination. What exists instead is a compelling phrase, repeated so often it has acquired the weight of fact, a weight it doesn't deserve. The irony is that the Beaufighter doesn't need the myth. 965 aerial victories, third highest in the Royal Air Force. An aircraft so difficult to fly that it killed its own pilots in training. An aircraft so heavily armed that a single pass could destroy a vessel. The men who flew it achieved results that any more comfortable aircraft might not have matched. They didn't need their victims to give them a romantic nickname. They needed to survive the next mission, and then the one after that. The radar equipment that made night fighting possible evolved dramatically during the war, and the Beaufighter evolved with it. The early AI Mark IV radar used a transmitter in the nose and receiver aerials on the wings, a configuration that worked but imposed significant aerodynamic penalties and required the operator to interpret fuzzy, ambiguous returns. The introduction of centimetric radar changed everything. The AI Mark VIII used a parabolic scanner housed in what crews called the thimble nose, a distinctive bulbous radome that replaced the original glazed nose. This new radar could detect smaller targets at greater ranges and guide the pilot to a firing solution with deadly accuracy. Guy Gibson flew Beaufighters with No. 29 Squadron during the night fighter phase of his career, before he became famous for leading the Dambusters raid. In his memoir, Enemy Coast Ahead, Gibson wrote that the Beau wasn't behaving itself, that it was troublesome with other pilots. These are the words of a man who would go on to lead one of the most demanding precision raids of the entire war. A man who understood aircraft limitations intimately and accepted them as the price of capability. That Gibson found the Beaufighter troublesome is not an indictment. It's a recognition that the aircraft demanded respect, that it would punish carelessness. John Cat's Eyes Cunningham became the most famous night fighter pilot of the war, eventually shooting down 16 enemy aircraft while flying Beaufighters before transitioning to Mosquitos. The public was told his extraordinary night vision came from eating carrots, a cover story designed to protect the secret of airborne interception radar. But the reality inside that cockpit had nothing to do with vegetables. Picture the mission. Cunningham climbs to patrol altitude over southern England. The ground invisible below. The only illumination, the dim glow of instruments. His radar operator, hunched over the AI set, watches the cathode ray tube for telltale blips indicating a contact. There, A return, range 4 miles, slightly below, bearing 270. Cunningham banks toward it, throttles adjusted to close the distance without overshooting. The blip grows stronger. 2 miles, 1 mile. The radar operator calls range continuously now, voice tight with concentration. And then Cunningham sees it. The exhaust flames of a Heinkel HE-111, pale orange against the blackness. The silhouette of twin tails just visible against the stars. He closes to 200 yards, close enough to see the dorsal gunner's turret rotating, searching for the threat the German crew knows is there, but cannot find. 4 20mm cannons open fire. The night explodes into fragments of aluminium and burning fuel. Another kill for Cat's Eyes. Another family in Germany that will receive a telegram. And the Beaufighter banks away into darkness, hunting for the next contact. But Cunningham wasn't alone in mastering the Beaufighter's peculiar demands. Bob Braham became one of the war's highest-scoring night fighter aces, with 29 confirmed victories, many of them in Beaufighters. Braham understood something essential about the aircraft. It rewarded aggression and punished hesitation. On the night of June 17, 1943, Braham encountered a Messerschmitt Bf-110 over the Netherlands. The German pilot was skilled, experienced, and flying an aircraft with nearly identical performance characteristics. What followed was a turning, diving duel that lasted 12 minutes, an eternity in night combat where most engagements ended in seconds. Braham used the Beaufighter's weight and armament rather than fighting against them. He refused to turn with the Bf-110, instead extending away and coming back for slashing attacks that maximized his forward firepower. Each pass, he put rounds into the German aircraft. Each pass, the Bf-110 leaked more fuel, lost more controls, slowed a little more. On the 4th pass, Braham's cannon shells found the port engine. The Messerschmitt rolled onto its back and dove into the darkness below. The observer position was particularly exposed during these fights. Seated behind the pilot in a separate section of the fuselage, the navigator and radar operator worked in relative isolation, communicating through the intercom while monitoring equipment and calculating interception vectors. The position offered limited visibility forward and practically none to the rear. When enemy fire came, and it often did, the observer sat inside a perspex dome that might as well have been a fishbowl. One veteran described the experience in terms that still carry genuine terror. Watching bullets going right through the perspex dome around you, just missing you. The perspex cracking, splinters flying, cold air rushing in through holes that weren't there a second ago. Knowing that each burst of fire is a lottery and the next ticket might have your number on it. You can't maneuver, you can't fire back. You sit and you watch, and you try to keep your voice steady on the intercom, because the pilot needs your navigation and doesn't need your fear. The Mediterranean theatre brought different challenges. Malta, that unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the sea, became home to Beaufighter squadrons tasked with interdicting Axis supply convoys to North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps needed fuel, ammunition and food. The convoys carrying those supplies had to pass within range of Malta-based aircraft, and the Beaufighters made them pay for every mile. No. 272 Squadron operated from Lucca and Takali airfields, flying missions that became legendary for their ferocity. On April 16, 1943, 8 Beaufighters from the squadron attacked a heavily escorted convoy bound for Tunisia. The merchantmen were protected by destroyers and covered by Messerschmitt Bf-109's flying top cover. The Beaufighters came in at mast height, so low their propellers threw up spray from the Mediterranean, while Spitfires engaged the German fighters above. The first pass destroyed 2 cargo ships outright. Torpedoes struck the largest vessel amidships, while cannon fire raked the decks of the escorts. The return fire was murderous. 3 Beaufighters took hits. One, piloted by a New Zealander named Jack Davenport, caught fire from a 37mm shell through the wing root. Davenport held his attack run, released his torpedo, and then fought the burning aircraft back toward Malta for 47 minutes before ditching in St. Paul's Bay. He and his navigator survived. The convoy didn't. Coastal Command's Beaufighter strike wings wrote their own chapter in the waters of the Bay of Biscay and approaches to occupied Norway. Rocket-armed Beaufighters carrying 8 RP-3 rockets beneath their wings, each projectile packing a 60-pound warhead capable of punching through a submarine's pressure hull. The tactics were brutal in their simplicity. Approach at wave-top height to avoid radar detection. Pop up to acquire the target and launch the rockets in a shallow dive while simultaneously opening fire with the nose cannons. The U-boats had learned to fear these attacks by mid-1943. Caught on the surface during transit, forced up to charge their batteries, submarine crews had minutes at most between the first sighting of aircraft and the arrival of rockets. The Beaufighters came in formations, different bearings, overwhelming the anti-aircraft guns. One pilot described it as flying into a wall of fire and hoping you came out the other side. Many didn't. But the submarines that survived the first pass rarely survived the second, as the strike wing reformed and attacked again. In the Bay of Biscay alone, Coastal Command Beaufighters accounted for dozens of U-boats caught on the surface during transit. The rockets and cannons doing in seconds what depth charges took hours to achieve. While the Beaufighters were perfecting their murderous trade over the Bay of Biscay, planners in Britain organised a triumph that would become a debacle. The liberation of Paris called for a demonstration of Allied air power, Beaufighters roaring over the Champs-Élysées to celebrate freedom regained. British intelligence arranged the timing with meticulous care. The crowds gathered, champagne was uncorked, and nothing happened. British time was calculated at BST rather than the correct BDST, and the planners had forgotten that Germany had changed occupied France to Berlin time. The Beaufighters arrived an hour late. After the symbolic moment had passed, after the crowds had begun to disperse, after the greatest flyover of the war had become an embarrassing footnote. It was the kind of mundane, unglamorous error that follows the barroom hooligan wherever it goes. The thoroughbred gets the victory parade. The hooligan shows up late to the party with grass stains on his trousers. And that brings us to Australia. Because if you want to understand what the Beaufighter could become in the hands of people who actually listen to their combat pilots, you need to cross to the other side of the world. A persistent blind spot in British-centric accounts of the air war overlooks the Commonwealth contribution. The South African squadrons, the Canadian crews, the New Zealanders who flew from Malta, and especially the Australians who built their own Beaufighters when the supply lines across the Indian Ocean became too long and too dangerous to trust. The Department of Aircraft Production, DAP, pronounced as 3 separate letters, DAP, not as the word DAP, took on the task of manufacturing Beaufighters in Australia. They didn't simply copy the British design, they improved it. Picture the factory floor at Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne, early 1942. Japanese forces have taken Singapore. Darwin has been bombed. The northern approaches to Australia lie open, and supply lines from Britain stretch across oceans infested with enemy submarines. The workers at DAP, men and women who 6 months earlier had been making cars or farm equipment or nothing at all, now stand in front of partially assembled fuselages, following blueprints that arrived photographed and transmitted by cable because there wasn't time to wait for the originals to cross by ship. Consider what building a fighter aircraft from a telegram actually means. Bristol's drawings were photographed, reduced to microfilm, and transmitted via undersea cable to Melbourne. The DAP engineers received these images, often blurry, sometimes incomplete, occasionally missing critical dimensions, and had to reverse engineer entire sub-assemblies. A rivet pattern that Bristol workers could copy by walking across the factory floor had to be inferred from a grainy photograph. Tolerances that British machinists learned through years of experience had to be reinvented by Australians who had never built anything more complex than a truck chassis. When a component didn't fit, and components frequently didn't fit, there was no one to call, no hotline to Filton, no night flight bringing an engineer with the answer. The Australians had to figure it out themselves, adapt their methods, substitute materials, and pray that the modifications they made wouldn't cause the aircraft to come apart in flight. The resulting DAP Beaufighter Mark 21 was not merely an Australian-built copy. It mounted an armament configuration that Australian crews had specifically requested based on their Pacific combat experience. 4 20mm Hispano cannons in the nose, as per the British original, but replacing the wing-mounted .303-inch Browning machine guns with 4.50 caliber Browning heavy machine guns. This change was not cosmetic. The .303 round, designed for rifle cartridges in the previous century, simply lacked the kinetic energy to do meaningful damage to Pacific theatre targets. A burst of .303 fire hitting a Japanese barge might puncture the hull and wound a few sailors. A burst of .50 caliber fire turned that same barge into kindling. The heavier rounds punched through engine blocks, demolished crew positions, and provided the kind of suppressive firepower that kept enemy gunners' heads down during attack runs. Australian pilots fighting in New Guinea and the Pacific Islands didn't need elegant solutions. They needed something that killed the enemy before the enemy killed them. The RAF crews who flew from Port Moresby in 1943 faced conditions that would have tested any aircraft, and the Beaufighter's limitations became deadly real in that theatre. It was dangerously slow in the presence of Japanese fighters. The Zero and Ki-43 could run rings around it in a dogfight. The tactics developed to compensate were simple and brutal. Never get into a turning fight. Rely on the concentrated forward firepower and pray that your first pass was decisive, because you might not get a second. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943 demonstrated what Beaufighters could accomplish when employed with tactical imagination. Japanese convoys attempting to reinforce their garrison at Lae faced coordinated attacks from American and Australian aircraft. The RAF Beaufighters came in at mast height, so low that their propellers kicked up spray from the wave tops, strafing the transport ships and their escorts with concentrated cannon fire. 8 Japanese troop transports and 4 destroyers went to the bottom. The reinforcement convoy was annihilated. The Beaufighter had proven itself as a ship killer of the first order. The Beaufighter demanded accommodation. It killed RAF pilots who didn't provide it. And yet the crews who mastered its temperament achieved results that the more agile fighters couldn't match. Destroying shipping, hammering ground positions, providing fire support that turned battles. The barroom Hooligan didn't care about grace. It cared about results. So here's where we end up. The Mosquito was beautiful, everyone agrees. The wooden construction, the racing lines, the speed that made it legendary, all of it deserved celebration. But the Beaufighter walked into the same war, got into fights, broke furniture, hurt people on both sides, and walked out with more confirmed aerial victories. 965, third deadliest in the Royal Air Force. The crews who flew this troublesome aircraft into combat didn't need a poetic nickname invented by publicists and repeated by authors who never checked the source. They needed an aircraft that could take punishment, deliver firepower, and bring them home. The Beaufighter did that, ugliness and all. Legends are comfortable. The truth is better. Subscribe for more stories like this.